Everyone working in the bank observed it not happening. One man stepped after another mentioned a word. Forward was meant to be a brief. Aaron, nothing more complicated, Mrs. Evelyn. Daniels left the sun of morning and into the cold air of Crescent Bank. And Faith in Birmingham, Alabama. She adjusted her purse on her arm, holding a little bundle of papers, her record, information ID, and withdrawal slip. For more over 3 years, she had always turned to banks. Decades each first Monday of the month. She came and withdrew like clockwork. Sufficient money for her essentials and bills. And chatted friendly greetings with everybody. Behind the counter today has not changed. The bank lobby had the normal silence, whisper with mild tones, the beeps of card readers, the odd times. Footfall. A row of tellers worked on. Behind the desk, a few patrons waited in line. An elderly man in a navy suit sat in the corner completing a layback slip. It was Monday morning, normal, till Evelyn changed her direction. Forward in line, her heels create a soft sound of tapping upon the polished floor, her head straight as she waited. She considered her way forward. Grandson had promised to visit and repair that shaky shelf in her kitchen. About how already the outdoor heat was intolerable and far from noon. About whether she kept enough eggs at home to later then prepare cornbread. That was her. She stood up to go to the counter, waving a friendly grin to the young teller. He hardly looked at his name tag. Reed Brandon. He seemed to be no older than 25. With weary eyes and the sort of irritability that made it abundantly evident he lacked eager to be. Good morning, young man, Evelyn here. Greeted with sliding her withdrawal slip and it towards him. I want to remove $800 from my account. Brandon picked up the papers instead of the typical normal computer typing, confirming the account she is handing her. Cash wrinkled his face and examined her ID a little too long, reversing it and forth since something didn't seem to add up. This is a sizable withdrawal, he murmured. Must verify something. Evelyn's smile wavers in scope. $800 wasn't great for someone who had been banking here more than Brandon had been alive, but she stayed patient. Naturally, sweetie, take your time, she claimed, laying her hands over her pocketbook. Brandon entered something into his computer. His eyes narrow at the computer screen. Then, without glancing at her, he talked once more. I will want more confirming before I can handle this. Evelyn blinked. Excusing me. You should show another kind of identification, Brandon mentioned. Evelyn scowled angrily. This had never happened before, not once in 30 years of life. Entering. Right now I have my driver's license here. There, she pointed to the card on Brandon's counter. Breathing was harsh, like she was acting challenging. But we really need other identification for withdrawals across a given period of time. Amount of stop. Evelyn sensed something change inside her, something delicate but obvious from when she inquired. Brandon didn't reply right away. He then looked to another teller, murmured something, then went back to stare at the screen, neglecting her inquiry. Totally, Evelyn turned to look behind her. The line had expanded. A few others were seen now, some discreetly, others freely. She could sense the heat mounting, but not from the Alabama sun. This time she grabbed a breath, keeps her speech clear. Solid, young man, I have been banking here since I never knew until you were born. Had to present extra ID before anything. Exactly. In the Brandon's lips contracted to a thin line. I should ask a management, he said. Not too long later, without waiting for her, he got up and started to walk away, anything about which I felt inadequate. Properly, but that was only the start. Evelyn inhaled softly, fighting the need. Looking around, she could sense eyes on her, observing, unexpectedly evaluating the air inside the bank. Felt heavier and thicker, akin to the temperature had changed just a few degrees. She turned to look at Brandon's counter. Had left her ID laying about. Her name and photo the same. Data she had consulted here for years, yet somehow today it wasn't enough. Some feet. Brandon was standing next to a woman in a rigidity gray. Block the bank manager, they spoke in low tones, but Evelyn grabbed the brief glances thrown. She tightened her fingers in direction about the strap of her purse. She considered the last visit. She had observed something similar, not to her, however, to a friend of hers, Miss Lorraine, who had visited in search of a refrigerator's final. Some of the salesmen had all but disregarded. First, waiting on other patrons first. Wonder whether she could afford it when at last she attracted his interest. She had left ashamed, driving across town just to spend her money somewhere else. Evelyn had shook her head at the time, contemplating, not something I would experience yet here. Brandon came back first, strolling back from his station without running over her. Looks the manager followed a few short seconds later, standing tall with her arms crossed, staring down Evelyn like she has recently been removed from something far increased. Vital, ma'am, the woman began to speak. Clipped and professional. We have to be careful about dishonest behavior. Do you also have another kind of? Evelyn tipped her head in identification. Somewhat misleading. Indeed, the management already mentioned activities. Sounding annoyed as they explained it. Was a discomfort we deal with. Policies abound. In order to stop illegal withdrawals, and with such a sum, we merely need to verify a number like what Evelyn cut. In maintaining her level of tone. $800 today. The management has problems right now. Got caught off target for a split second, then got back on track. She said this as a security precaution. For your. Evelyn let the words hang. She was protecting between them for a moment. For your protection, the term meant to be used, seemed comforting, yet something about it felt as though it was a weak cover for anything else. She thought honestly that this was happening here. Regarding all the times she had entered this bank, talked with tellers, and they grinned at managers, and never ever once been made to sense as she felt she lacked belongs until Evelyn groaned today and felt within her purse drawing a tiny card. Here, she said, turning over her Medicare ID will be sufficient for the manager to take. It hardly noticed it before shaking she head. We require a secondary governor produced ID. Evelyn's calm helped to thin my. Right there sits a driver's license. She mentioned it had my name and picture, tackle, and the signature I applied on every transaction housed in this structure for 30 years. The management did not flinch. No, ma'am, but policy dictates otherwise. Repeated, using the same tone she used to talk down to kids or anyone who were hard of nature. If that is, Evelyn's jaw constricted. Policy then indicated to me this, gesturing toward the upcoming client in line A. Man in middle age wearing a button-down shirt. Therefore, keys. Did you ask him for 2 types of identification? Before his creation. Transaction. The manager slowed down, her lips pushed into a narrow line. The man. And Caius looked up from his phone, shocked by the abrupt focus. He hadn't been requested additional. Everyone in the bank was familiar with it, and still no one mentioned Evelyn's. Her heart hammered faster in her chest. She had spent a lifetime identifying pivotal events, similar to the kind where you might swallow it down and proceed, or counterbalance and danger resulting in a scenario she disliked producing. Scenes she never had anything regarding this moment led her to reject too. She straightened her shoulders in shrinkage, staring the manager straight in the eye. I want to talk to someone else, she claimed. The boss gave a tight-lipped smile. And I am the Evelyn, the supervisor, fixed her eye. Then fetch me someone higher than you. The manager stopped, staring eyes moving, approaching Brandon, who then abruptly seemed to be quite fascinated by his keyboard. For a long time, nobody spoke in the room. Felt too quiet. Suddenly a voice emerged from the silence. Exists here, but depth is a problem. Calm. Calling. Every head turned toward the entrance, and that is where everything modified. The voice came from close to the access. A man standing tall in a neat navy blue suit. His alone presence seemed to change the room's air conditioning system. The bank manager turned slightly to educate her face into something civil but apprehensive. Evelyn, though, identified him just now. Charles Bennett was not just another client. He was a well-known businessman, former city councilman, and someone really profoundly honored in his impact in the society went beyond the walls of this bank, beyond this neighborhood, and he understood. Evelyn had seen him on the television, shaking hands with mayors, presenting at fundraisers, cutting ribbons at great grand doors. She had even crossed once years ago at a church function, and now here he was gazing down the bank manager like he already understood just what was. The manager stopped before at last, forming a tight smile. No trouble at all, Mr. Bennett. We are merely following standard. Charles moved forward, following a protocol. Polished shoes resonating with the tile floor. He turned to see Evelyn, then back at the much manager. Would you be kindly explaining exactly what that implies in this context? The manager straightened her shoulders. We have security policies in location designated for specific withdrawals, and we're only asking for extra recognition of $4,800, Charles says in a cool but precise. The manager's lips opened just a little. Was obvious she hadn't anticipated to be questioned thus directly, at least not in front of a audience. EVN sensed the buzz in the room. Shift patrons were listening now. Some were posing as not having, eyes darting in between their phones and the scene developing right in front of them. Others weren't even aiming for subtlety concerning it. The dude from Karis from past years? Arranged randomly. Uncomfortably, a woman in blue sundress next to the ATM looked over the then pushed her husband. Even Brandon, the teller, seemed to be wishing he could vanish beneath his watch. Charles not made eye contact. Told me something, the manager said. Something he stated, voice still flows smoothly. Found Mrs. Daniels' length of time banking here. The manager hesitated. EVN responded for hers 30 years. Charles nodded. In those 30 Years, how many times have you gone? Asked her to stop withdrawing like way. Calm the manager's clenched jaw. Hands joined tightly in front of her. Mr. Bennett, with all due respect. Respect, this isn't about respect, Charles. Stopped his speech still. Even this relates to your policies. Is really a policy, or else it's simply underlined by enforced. Specifically particular statement landed a wave of consciousness flowed across the chamber. Someone in the rear murmured, anything. They are breathing under. The security guard next to the door moved. The manager inhaled uncomfortably. Articulation. Illegible, as I mentioned. We're just trying. Charles expelled through to stop fraud. His nose quivering slightly, his head somewhat crooked. Fraud. Right, he turned back to Evelyn. Mrs. Daniels, have you ever engaged in fraud? Evelyn gave a little dry chuckle. Not once in 78 years. No, her voice carried no trace of laughter. Only made the occasion weightier. Charles swung back to the manager, and nonetheless she is the one being handled as if a criminal before a room bursting with people. Evelyn felt something she found difficult to precisely name. Vindication could be either merely relief or perhaps more. Face stayed composed. She had spent her whole life negotiating circumstances like to this gently, but Charles neglected to must have his presence alone to make them consider everything. The manager let out in slow motion. But before she could complete, an older man in a black suit moved forward. From the adjacent office, the branch director. That's sufficient, he remarked, voice strong. He turned directly toward the manager's procedure. In the retraction, the manager tensed, but not. Ed swallowed whatever argument she had left. She looked at Brandon go ahead of Brandon's rapid finger movements. Now across the keyboard his former EVN let out a hesitation. Totally gone. Slow breathing observation while he numbered out. She had been entitled to cash bills starting from the very beginning, but the damage had already been completed. She turned, somewhat absorbing the facial expressions of those close to her, the ones who had watched but said nothing, the people who had turned aside the instant events turned unpleasant, the ones meant to have let this transpire should Charles Bennett hadn't gone in, and it was the portion stung the most. She had lived her whole life being meticulous, dressing a particular way, speaking a specific manner, never causing disturbance, and still there she was as Brandon at last slid the money towards her. Evelyn grabbed it silently. She said nothing of thanks, since this wasn't a favor, this wasn't yet over. Evelyn pushed the money into her handbag. Her face is steadied by fingers illegible yet inside a storm brewed. She turned toward Charles Bennett, the man who had spoken out when no one else had. Still, his face was in control. Still, he had another eye view. Maybe disapproval or disillusionment, not in her but in what have lately merely happened. The bank manager still stiff. Mrs. felt discomfort clear her throat. Daniels, thank you for your patience. Evelyn's eyes strayed to her. Do you? The manager stopped Evelyn and corrected the strap of her purse. Since from here I'm standing looked quite much like you had anticipated, I was pilfering my own funds. A whirl rippled across the bank. The tension hadn't lifted, it had just adapted. Form. The manager opened her mouth, looking for the correct terminology, something to smooth over, something to enable this moment disappears. Charles folded his arms. I find interesting something he mentioned. Staring straight at her, would you have Requested 2 forms of ID if I had. Strolled in here and asked for the same. Withdrawal the boss neglected to address. Stillness. Stretched you. I know the solution as well. Charles carried on, and that is exactly the issue. His words landed like a hammer. A woman in line moved quickly looking at her phone. The man in Kai's couched his voice and corrected his attitude as though he could be anywhere. Even here the security guard close to the door moved his eyes to the branch director, the one who had overturned the manager only few minutes ago, at last spoke, claiming his misjudgment was his voice under control but measured. Mrs. Daniels, I truly apologize for the this was the manner this was treated Evelyn under observation, allowing the words float momentarily in the air, and then she posed the inquiry with which she had been seated on her tongue from the moment. This, considering how often this occurs to people, enjoy me when none else is around to talk. Up the director's face hardly changed. Nevertheless, that moment of doubt expressed enough. Charles let out a soft breath. More often than they would ever confess to. Evelyn nodded, holding the strap of her. She had grown to purse a bit tighter. With money she had acquired her so-called apologies, yet something in her chest still felt weighed, since she wasn't the only one who had held this post before. And she would not be the last. As she turned to head off, Charles moved next to her. So I could lead you out, he stated. Evelyn silently handed him a little thank you note. Nod, but Evelyn wasn't done yet. Ly moved toward the door, Charles strolling next. She started the instant they arrived at the door. Stopped. Something inside her rejected to. She turned back. The end here. Bank was overly silent today. Consumers who had used to be impatiently tapping their feet were fast fixed to their places there. Interest divided among acting not to eavesdrop and refuse to get included. The manager still in action. Behind the counter, she seemed relieved, most likely believing the worst was past. Evelyn was not about to let her go that way. She straightened her back quite quickly, adjusted the pearls around her neck, and not only addressed the manager but also every member of that room. You know, I have spent 78 years on our earth, and long ago I discovered how people like me treated when people believe none of us are. Seeing still no movement, yet today you got captured. The manager frozen, and Charles leaned his head slightly to see the instant arise. Evelyn moved forward, her words echoing constant. I know what this was. You knew what this was, and I need you to grasp something someone remembers when their treatment reflects their lack. Belong. She let the word to settle, observing the manager's face, observing all of their confronts you. Observe money spends the same everywhere. Whose hands it's in. She carried on, gently holding up her purse. Still respect, though, something you do not. Once you lose, get back once. Her remarks left a weight that stayed. Not many people changed. One of the awkward ones among tellers, not Brandon, but a young woman at the ensuing counter, turned down to her hands, unexpectedly unable to match Evelyn's stare. Still standing off, the branch director to the side cleared his voice. Mrs. Daniels, once again, I really apologize. I object to your apologies. Evelyn cut in. Her voice still speaks to me. I wish to know if you are about to act about this. Pause. The filmmaker stopped in mid-sentence. Beforehand responding, we will be looking over our rules and systems to guarantee that. Evelyn sighed silently. Airflow. MHM, it was a line, not a dedication. A practiced flawless answer intended to sound fantastic right now but be missed by Dawn. Charles spoke up. Beside her, I will be following up in month, he mentioned, his voice resonating through the room. And should I find that anything like this occurs once again, we will be having quite a different. The face of the directors did not flinch, albeit something about the way he changed his position informed Evelyn he recognized exactly what that implied. She looked at the people in the last time chamber, the quiet onlookers, the UNC friendly workers, the ones who would evening when you get home consider what they noticed but never mentioned a thing regarding. She then turned back at last toward the very door. Charles unlocked it for her, and as then the two of them entered Alabama. Evelyn let out a tiny cough from heat. Smaller, but she was not only considering regarding herself now, she was considering about the next person to stroll by means of those doors, treat the likewise, and who would be present to advocates for them.